Hey, in this section we're going to talk about sex and gender in anthropology. And the first thing we're going to do is make a distinction between sex and gender as terms. And this is a distinction that was, if not made specifically by, popularized within the field by Margaret Mead. If you haven't heard of Margaret Mead, she was probably the most famous anthropologist that there has ever been. She published in popular sources in addition to publishing for academia. She sort of caught the wave of a social issue which was becoming very important in Western culture, and so she became very well known. Probably your grandmother or great grandmother's generation would have known who she was, even if they had no interest in anthropology whatsoever. She's very well known across most of society. She's spoken about less now outside of anthropology, but within anthropology, she still is a very important figure. In any case, excuse me. In any case, the distinction between sex and gender is one that she used, and it's pretty straightforward. Sex is a biological condition, and gender is a social interpretation of that condition. Sexual dimorphism is a term that's long been used in biology to describe any sort of animal which has two different forms, that reproduces sexually and has two different sexual forms. Physically, biologically, has two different forms. Um, Gender, as I said, is a biocultural concept, meaning that it is to a large extent an interpretation of those underlying sex differences. But it is a social construct as well, in terms of in the sense the roles are something that in which there is some flexibility across cultures, and they are created by people. So much as I described kinship as a biocultural concept, one that is socially constructed but is has roots in an underlying reality and underlying biology. Gender is very similar. Right? We use the terms male and female to describe the biological condition, sex, and we use the terms masculine and feminine when we're talking about gender. Um, the picture up to the top left, top right, I should address that. I put that in as an example of sexual dimorphism in another species, and there are different degrees of sexual dimorphism in different species. In humans, there's sort of a moderate amount, as opposed to, let's say, a gorilla or something like that, where the males are literally twice the size of the females as a rule, and physically they're quite different. Um, in some cases, there's very little sexual dimorphism. Depends on the species. People are sort of in the middle in terms of the degree of sexual dimorphism. If we look to the right, there's a picture of two birds, and we'll recognize the one bird as a peacock, the other is a peahen. Right, so this is an illustration of sexual dimorphism in that particular species. Now, if you look at them, the peacock is the one that we recognize immediately because it has this brilliant plumage and this really long tail, which can fan up in a spectacular fashion. The female of the species does not have that. But if you took away the plumage and looked at just the form of the birds, their skeletal structure, their muscle mass, things, they're very similar. So they actually have a smaller degree of sexual dimorphism than humans, even though they look quite different. They're relatively minor differences. So that's what sexual dimorphism is, and it just describes biological condition of sex. Gender is the social interpretation of the underlying biological condition. All right. As sort of an exercise, I like to do surveys in class occasionally. We didn't really get to do that this semester. We had some interference, but in any case, this was one that I did. I had students just list terms that they associated with either, let me go back one, either masculine or feminine, and I used those terms intentionally, masculine or feminine traits. Right. So I let them come up with terms that they either consider to be masculine or feminine and categorize them. Once I got the information back, I took all the data and basically counted the incidence of different terms. So some terms weren't mentioned very often; they might have gotten left off of the ultimate interpretation. Most of them were still included, but some of them were frequently mentioned across many different people. Right, so what I ended up doing to represent this to the class was a word cloud, which is what we just saw, and I'm going to go back to it. So I did a word cloud for masculine and feminine categories. And so you can see these are the students' terms that they came up with out of their own heads to describe masculine or feminine traits. All right, so this was the first one is feminine. And if you can see that, hopefully everybody can see it on their screens all right. The larger words, if you don't know how word cloud works, larger words represent more incidents in which it was said by respondents. All right, so the most people said the biggest words. So we've got emotional, long hair was in there, nurturing, caring, sensitive, and then the words get smaller from there on in. And you can look at it more closely and pause it and look at it more closely if you like to. But I do want to point out that some of these things have something, certainly have some connection to underlying biological roles in the sense of childcare, right? Roles in reproduction. Those are certainly represented in here. There are also things like long hair, for example, which are clearly socially constructed. And there's no reason necessarily that having long hair should be a feminine trait. And there have been places and times when it was not. But it is very specifically, or it has been very specifically in Western culture for a period of time. So you can see elements of both. You can see things that have roots in biology. You can see things that have roots in no apparent roots in biology whatsoever, and they just seem to be pure social constructs. Makeup, for example. Well, I don't know. You could probably make a biological case for that too. Dresses, I don't know. Maybe. Long hair, definitely not. Let's look at the masculine traits. A lot of really biological ones that were standing out in this one. Muscles, athletic, strong, tall. Short hair, again, that one's arbitrary. That one's socially constructed. Aggressive, competitive, tough. Again, so there's a mix of social constructs and things that are definitely rooted in biology. And you can argue about the social constructs to the degree to which they are rooted in biology. All right. In the old days in anthropology, this amounted to well, we had a circumstance where everybody was very focused on the biology and they didn't really worry about the social interpretation. They assumed that gender constructs were all based entirely on biology and they were determined, in fact, by that biology. And we had a philosophical school called biological determinism. I wouldn't say philosophical exactly. It came out of the biology departments, was used in the social sciences. Biological determinism. All right, that was the idea in which the idea that gender roles are inflexible because they are deeply rooted in biology. You can't change them because they are biological, and our behavior in large part is biological. If you recall, the last lecture or the one before that talked a little bit about sociobiology, and that was another school that came out of biology, in which they were trying to describe or explain all behavior that humans engage in based on their biology. So that was a biological determinist point of view. Right? So in anthropology, prior to say the 1960s and 70s, there was a biological determinism that dominated their interpretation of everything that went on. As a result, they had what's called the man-the-hunter paradigm, and that was their explanation for the sexual division of labor, which they saw basically across human cultures. I mean, we mentioned that before too when we talked about subsistence. When we talked about hunter-gatherers, I pointed out that across the ethnographic record, as far as we know, there is pretty consistently a sexual division of labor. Now, there's some variation in that sexual division of labor. I had a chart somewhere. We'll see a chart later. It's in the slides. It's just not in this particular slide. So there is a sexual division of labor across those cultures. If we look across the ethnographic record, and it is somewhat consistent. There are some things that pretty much always fall to men, and some things that pretty much always fall to women. There also are swing categories where it could go either way, right? So, and there is some flexibility in those end categories sometimes as well. So there's a fair amount of consistency with some flexibility across cultures in terms of the sexual division of labor. But in describing it in prior to the 1960s and 70s in anthropology, they used the man-the-hunter paradigm. Right. And this was based on the idea that hunting, first of all, was the most important thing in terms of feeding groups of people in hunting and gathering life. That turned out later to be wrong. We'll talk about that more. But that was the basic underlying assumption. And there was the assumption that women stayed at home and took care of the kids, and men went out and got the food and supported the family. And excuse me, once they went out into the field, they found out that that really wasn't quite the case. What they found was, particularly when women entered into the field in the 1970s en masse, they learned a lot more about what was going on in these cultures. Prior to that, mostly men were in anthropology, mostly men were doing the analysis and asking the questions. So they would go out and they were subject to the constraints of the people that they were studying. So if they went into a hunting and gathering group, they were subject to the whatever rules that they had. And if they were a single man that went into the group, then they really only had access to the other men in the group for the most part, or they certainly didn't have access to things that only women were doing. So they were dramatically underestimating a lot of what was going on in terms of economic production. When women entered into the field in the 1960s and 70s, that a lot of that changed because because they were women in that context, they had a different role based on the interpretation of the people they were studying, and so they had access to different things. If we think back to the Chagnon piece that we read earlier in the year on the Yanomamo, if he had decided to go down there and just study women's labor and said, well, I'm going to hang around with your women and I don't really care what the men do, I'm just going to hang around with the women all the time, that may have caused some friction in that particular situation. If you recall, it was fairly tense anyway. Right? So it's just a fact that when people go from a Western culture into another culture, then they are subject to the rules of that culture. It doesn't really matter what ideology you bring to the situation. They have their own ideas about how things work. And so men didn't necessarily have access to what women were doing. When single women went into the field, they did have access to what the women were doing. Didn't necessarily have complete access to what the men were doing. Right? Something they figured out even later, when some of those anthropologists got married and started doing work as teams, was that they also got treated differently when they came as a couple than if they came as individuals. Right? Because in a lot of cultures, you're not even really considered to be an adult until you're married, have a household, and potentially children. So if an individual shows up there, they think something's wrong with them, or they're neglecting their family, or something like that, which may be true. I don't know. In any case, the people would often interact with them differently if they came as a couple. So they got access to a whole bunch of other information that was being missed out on in the early days of anthropology. Excuse me. So one of the things that they realized was the man-to-hunter paradigm didn't work out at all. First of all, when they started actually counting the calories that came in, they found that women produced more than half of the calories that kept the groups alive. On average, it was something like 65%, up to 85%, depending on how they were making a living in the first place. There's some variety in hunters and gatherers, largely based on where they are. If they're in a desert, things are harder than if they're in a relatively productive piece of land. If they're in the Arctic, it's different. So, excuse me. So yeah, there's variety across across hunter-gatherer groups. So some of them, the disparity is fairly close. Still, the women produce more. Remember, the basic sexual division of labor is women do most of the gathering, men do most of the hunting. That's true mostly across the hunting and gathering groups. On the other hand, again, if you're in the Arctic, most of the calories come from hunting. So that would be an exception to the rule. If you're in a desert, most of the calories do not come from hunting. And so you tend to see it more toward the 85% for women. Their gathering activities provide most of what keeps people alive. Once women entered into the field, they figured these things out. The man-the-hunter paradigm just didn't seem to work out. And the way it was ultimately interpreted was as a projection of Western gender roles on subjects. Because at the time, you have to think about the time, nothing happens outside of the context of history. In the 1940s and 50s and even the 60s in the United States, you mostly had a situation where men were going out and working, and there were actually housewives who stayed home, didn't work outside the home. They just stayed home and raised their families. So the idea was, since it's all men studying the thing, and they didn't realize the other half of what was going on, they were projecting this dynamic that they saw at home. which was something that's familiar, at least in our culture, even if not in practice. The idea of a male breadwinner. Right. So we'll stop there for now. That's where they were in the 1960s and 70s. There was a major shift after World War II, and we'll talk about that in the next section.